Thanks, Pedro. It's a huge pleasure to be with you all this afternoon, and I'll say a big thanks in advance to Alan, who's firing in my slides. And they're pretty basic, so I should apologise in advance, but you'll maybe understand the relevance. I should probably start with an apology. As I explained to Alan when he asked me to do this presentation, there's a very high risk that I'll end up insulting your intelligence, because what I'm going to say about overcoming apathy is really pretty basic, but we agreed that sometimes it's good to get back to basics, especially when we're facing so many quite fundamental problems, when it's never been more important for us to get the policy changes that will help us save our salmon, our sea trout and other freshwater fish. So here goes. Let's start by fleshing out the central problem. Assuming we're confident in the scientific case we're building, how do we get that science to policymakers? And how do we get that evidence translated into policy actions that will actually make a difference? Because I suspect there are very few people attending today who haven't been frustrated by apparent apathy in trying to achieve change, or maybe it's better described as inertia at various levels of policy making. Our biggest corporations spend millions of pounds tackling precisely that challenge, and some spend years devising and implementing their strategies. I've got just a few minutes to share my thoughts with you, but I believe that the crucial idea, the key that unlocks the door to most of what we are trying to achieve, can be expressed in just three simple words: make people care. Now, I learned that vital lesson 40 years ago as a cub newspaper reporter. Nothing to do with salmon, but please bear with me, because there's direct relevance to the big issues we're tackling today. So I'll ask you to picture the scene: the spotty, hairy graduate trainee being handed the usual round of rubbish stories. It was no surprise when I was asked to speak to a junior academic who turned up at reception. He was carrying a battered, bulging cardboard folder. He was muttering about differential pedestrian accident statistics with respect to guardrails. And my job was to listen politely and then escort him off the premises. Now, Douglas wouldn't mind me telling you that he didn't have the very best communication skills. He was absolutely passionate about his subject, but he'd failed to convince anyone beyond his small circle that he was onto something, because most of what he was saying sounded quite confusing, and some of it seemed counterintuitive. The national media wouldn't give him time of day, and he was obviously desperate, otherwise he wouldn't have been speaking to a cub reporter on a regional newspaper. But I took his research to some independent academics who didn't know him. They didn't want to say this publicly, but they thought his work was sound. I persuaded my editor to run with the story, because we translated Douglas's differential pedestrian accident statistics into a compelling story using language that would make people care. We reported that his research suggested that the pedestrian guardrails set up at roadsides all over Britain to keep people safe were actually responsible for the deaths of dozens of young children. Why? By hiding kids from approaching drivers before they stepped onto the road. Now, the full wrath of the UK's Department of Transport came down on our heads. They tried to discredit Douglas, they tried to discredit me, the newspaper. Interestingly, they avoided a direct challenge to the detail of his science, and we stuck resolutely with the story. Then, crucially, the public started to get interested. Finally, the politicians got involved, and after 3 months, the Department of Transport admitted that Douglas was right. And every single guardrail the length of Britain was ripped up and replaced with a design that let drivers see young children on the other side. Okay, there are lots of lessons there, but every experience I've had in 40 years of journalism and seeing the machinery of policy development at work, all of that has strengthened the central lesson for me: make people care and you get results. So lots more campaigns and investigations followed when the BBC offered me a job 30 years ago, it was on the one condition that I stopped campaigning. And fair enough, it's against BBC guidelines, but the same principles apply when we communicate ideas in every area of public policy. So no more ancient history, but I'll bore you with just one recent story from my time in journalism before we get back to salmon. Again, I hope you'll see the relevance. It was towards the end of my time at the BBC. One of my reporters came to me with a story about something that's probably touched most people here, maybe through your family, perhaps through a friend. It was about sepsis, the blood disease. It kills more than 40,000 people a year in the UK. It leaves many more people with terrible conditions. All the signs suggest that early diagnosis and treatment are vital to survival. So all the professional medical bodies and all the support groups have been calling for a national awareness campaign to promote early intervention and save lives. The Scottish Parliament's own Health Committee had demanded a national awareness campaign. But Scotland's then Health Secretary repeatedly refused to budge, saying it couldn't be justified. Reluctantly, the medical professionals were preparing to accept defeat. Then we ran a series of stories across BBC platforms, simply pointing out the very same science, but crucially including the stories of bereaved families, balanced with the Health Secretary's justification. Now, the morning after our most powerful broadcast on Reporting Scotland, I took a call from the Health Secretary's special advisor saying that she had more to say on the issue. And soon after that, she announced a U-turn. And you've maybe seen what followed, that the government posters, the TV and social media campaigns warning people about the early signs of sepsis. So, okay, you've got the point. The policy changed because the political machine got the message that finally people cared. Now, I know what you're thinking. It's easy to get policy changes when you're dealing with child deaths or deadly infections, and how does that translate to wild salmon and sea trout? And yes, the issues that we are facing are far more complex. As you've just heard, the likely suspects framework is a whole menu of scientific and public policy challenges, from the impact of climate change in our oceans and rivers, to fish farming, predation, habitat loss, you name it. And if there's one thing that's really impressive about our sector, apart from the sheer passion that we all bring to the table, it's our capacity to fight multiple battles on several fronts, all at the same time, and just sometimes against each other. In time, the framework will help to bring crucial focus, but we know there are also things we can do now, which will be dealt with in a minute. And then there's the cultural issue that dare not speak its name, but we've all seen it. The dismissal of wild salmon as a preoccupation of tweeny toffs. That's also changing, but it's taking time too. So in the face of all of that, how do we get our scientific evidence to policymakers and get that evidence translated into action on the ground? And how do we make sure that the whole process is treated with the urgency that it deserves? Well, government officials, civil servants and agency staff are obviously well versed in developing policy ideas using science. That's what they do. And what I'm about to say should not be taken as somehow being in opposition to that essential policy development process. On the contrary, I'd argue that we have a golden opportunity to help those officials by sticking remorselessly with the science and sometimes giving the process a very firm but helpful push when it's needed. It's about making people care at several levels. Now let's start with the most basic, about the science itself. Significant scientific findings obviously need to be communicated to stakeholders, but it's vital that the most important evidence is given a chance to break through to our politicians and crucially to the wider public. To do that, we need to speak their language. So if you're producing important research, ask yourself honestly, why should it matter to anyone else? Why should they care? Then just imagine having to explain it in an engaging way to a stranger in a noisy pub, if you can still remember what a noisy pub is. Doing it in just a few short sentences and without jargon. How would you grab their attention without compromising on the signs? It really is that simple, no dark arts. And if your findings really are important, use every conceivable tool to sell your story, from the mass media of TV, radio, online services and newspapers to the fast expanding world of social media. That's not rocket science either, and a few simple tips can take you a long way to getting significant media coverage. But that's maybe one for another day. Now, yes, there are some risks in taking research into the public arena, but that's where the most significant arguments are won or lost. We need to occupy that space. And if you're still thinking, that's all very well, but even the best communicated science in the world can sometimes fail to register with some of our politicians, I'd have to say you're right. We've seen it too often over the years, no matter how well briefed they might have been. Warm words are sometimes followed by action. But if we look back honestly over the last few years, have we really seen the urgency that our situation demands? The process of policy development and implementation has sometimes seemed glacial, and government agencies have too often appeared to be operating in silos rather than pulling together quickly for a common goal. I'll give you just one example from my relatively short time as chair of the River Dee Trust. As you'll know, the river is designated as a special area of conservation. It hosts an endangered population of freshwater pearl mussels. Their life cycle, as we know, is bound up with the Atlantic salmon, and our salmon stocks have seen the same dramatic declines as most other rivers. As you've heard from Lorraine's presentation this morning, of all the major salmon rivers, the Dee is especially vulnerable to damaging temperature rises. There are very few trees to provide vital shade across upper catchment. Our juvenile salmon stocks have come dangerously close to serious damage, and we've been warned to expect more extreme temperatures in years to come. Now, Marine Scotland Science has produced excellent temperature mapping, which shows just how vulnerable our system is, and we know it's a national problem. We saw the illustration earlier this morning. Marine Scotland is now among a growing number of bodies actively advocating bankside tree planting to protect our salmon and the wider ecosystem. I was very encouraged by Angie's contribution this morning. But just to underline the point, last year we announced plans to double our rate of tree planting. We called it, as Lorraine explained, the Million Trees campaign. You might have seen it on TV, radio, online, national newspapers, social media. It's all native woodland, much of it planted in small enclosures. It's work of the highest possible conservation value. And we've had some very helpful grant funding for several one-off projects. But as Lorraine also explained, we won't get a penny of grant aid from Scottish Forestry for the crucial small-scale enclosures because it doesn't fit their funding models. It'd be very different if we wanted to blanket a hillside with trees. So we've joined forces with other trusts through FMS to make the case for change. That's now cutting through with the public, people with no previous interest in our salmon or our rivers, because we're making a case about the loss of their natural heritage, and we're doing it in a language that they understand. Fisheries Management Scotland have made representations to Scottish Forestry calling for reform. The Missing Salmon Alliance are also beating the drum along with other bodies. It's a state of affairs that at best could be described as perverse. For the government to say they're taking our salmon crisis seriously, and so far at least, not to support strategic national action that will specifically help salmon. Some might call it a scandal. We haven't taken that particular debate to the public, not yet. As we've heard, Marine Scotland are very engaged with the issue. We've now had expressions of support from all our leading political parties. I even took a call from a Scottish Government minister a few weeks ago asking, how can I help? We're waiting impatiently to see how those encouraging words translate into urgent action to deliver policy changes. Of course, the ultimate illustration is the lamentable history of policy development on fish farming. Despite the best efforts of Fisheries Management Scotland, among others, we still don't have a regulatory regime that's fit for purpose. Now, I don't have time to pick over those particular entrails, and I'm sure that you know the sorry story far better than I do. But we really have reached the point for all the issues affecting our sector where our politicians must be made to care. We know that they engage best when their electorates sit up and pay attention, so we have to redouble our efforts to engage the public. It won't have escaped your notice that the campaign to make people care is well underway. It's been happening in the excellent communications work of FMS, the other members of the MSA, and the great alphabet soup of salmon conservation bodies have been involved directly in some of that strategy development. So when the Scottish Government announced the lowest salmon catches ever recorded, FMS were ready to publicise several key messages that our iconic salmon stocks were approaching crisis point. I'd ask you please to note the word our. We were encouraging the public to take ownership of their native species, to care about their fate. Obviously, we acknowledge the complexity of the challenges, but with respect to the factors affecting our rivers and coasts, we called on the Scottish Government and its agencies to work together urgently in areas where they can make a difference. These messages were summarised in a simple demand to make saving our salmon a national conservation priority. Some of that language is now being reflected in official policy papers. This was covered by virtually all our media across Scotland and the UK. It achieved a relatively high level of public resonance, and many of our politicians have engaged positively over the time that's followed. Since then, we've seen many of the most influential wild salmon organisations joining forces. This is a golden opportunity to agree on priorities and speak with a united voice. Our key messages must be repeated endlessly, and taken to community groups and businesses, anyone who can be engaged. Our main demands need to be understood and accepted right across Scotland, from villages in the Highlands to housing estates in Glasgow. And to be effective, we need to embed the public's sense of ownership of the species, to be crystal clear that it's their own heritage that's under threat. It's not just a species at stake, it's our national Scottish heritage, something we all really care about. So when our politicians and agencies do respond quickly in areas where the science demands action, we should give them full credit, praise them to the rafters. They should be rewarded for imaginative thinking and for delivering change. But if they fail to act, if they obfuscate, if they're content to kick issues into the long grass while our salmon continue to decline, we owe it to the public to call them to account, and it will then be up to the public to hold them to account. Thanks very much.